Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Satnam B. For today's tutorial, we're going to look at how to create a stylized neon sign. The visual outcome is something you could use on an album cover, a t-shirt, or some kind of print media. The visual direction I'm aiming for with this design is more towards the Asian restaurant kind of vibe. I've collected a few images on Pexels which will serve as like inspiration for this kind of project. If you are starting out with any stylized work, it's always best to try and find some source media to then be inspired from directly, as opposed to trying to rehash someone else's design. When you look at some of these visuals, the first thing you will see is the typography. The typography typically will be something that's either more sans serif with like more of a rounded edge, or it will be typefaces that will have more of a flowy, almost organic feel. These are then supplemented with additional text like subheadings and sort of like offers. And then lastly, some will have cool iconography, things like burgers, fries, sushi, and even currency, basically anything that can represent the store itself. So if we jump into Illustrator, the first thing I like to do is set up a basic grid that will help me organize things. The idea for this isn't to create some kind of exact grid to follow, but more so just to help with placements. To split the rectangle into a grid, all you have to do is go to Object, Paths, Split into Grid, and then you just insert a value which will be equal on the horizontal as well as the vertical axis, and then you'll get a square grid. Once the grid is built, you have to right click and click Make Guides. You can also lock the guides as well. Next, we need to add in our type. So for the type, I'm using a font called Rounded M+1C, which is available on Google Fonts. The actual copy is just going to be some generic text. For this, I'm just going to use Neon Rice. The next thing we need to do is increase the tracking on the entire line. This will allow us to include some minor details later on, but it's good to start off knowing what you're going to do firstly, as it allows you to ensure the spacing between the letters works best and still maintains legibility. Once you're happy with the tracking and the kerning of the letters, we need to expand this text box to allow us to build up the visual style. Go to Object and click Expand. Next, flip the stroke and the fill so we get a fat black line around the text. You may have to increase the stroke width to be around 10 to really make it stand out. I would also recommend swapping the stroke to be on the outer edge. Next, we're going to add some additional subheading text. So for this, I'm going to add open late and serving fresh food translated to Japanese. This will be pasted into the artboard. The font will be changed to something I found on Adobe Fonts. I wanted to go with a font choice which has a sort of bold and curvy visual style to it. There will be many different Japanese fonts you can find online. I would suggest looking at Google Fonts as they support more languages, but Adobe Fonts or wherever you find fonts probably will have them, providing you are looking for Japanese fonts. The placement of the text is quite simple. All we're going to have is one piece of text above the main logo and then one below. Centralize them to the artboard and then just add a little bit of space just so that there's enough buffer room for when we add the icons and the rounded edges. Now, using the rectangle tool, all we're going to do is just add in a rectangle around both pieces of text. This will create a sort of framing structure which will hold the supplementary text. You want to play with the corners to be more rounded. This will depend on your actual typography itself. Once again, now that we've added this additional boxing element, you may have to play with the placement just to incorporate a little bit more excess space below the Neon Rice logo. I've mentioned icons a few times and I'm going to show you how I tackle them. I'm going to sort of talk you through the process as opposed to showing you each icon being built, as it's kind of repetitive and each icon will be very specific to whatever you're creating. So what we have here are 4 different icons. We have a rice bowl, a steamed fish, a burger, and a noodle pot. So for my approach for making icons, what I like to use is basic shapes. So I use circles, squares, and triangles to just try and build up the basic forms, and then use the shape builder tool to join and remove parts. I then like to use different layering approaches to create the icon I want to make. The rice bowl was really easy as we're just using a basic bowl which was created from a rectangle and then a few circles to create the actual rice itself. For the steamed fish icon, I wanted to create a bamboo steamer. This was to help add to the idea of steaming the fish, but the fish itself went through a few different phases. I tried to draw the tail a few different ways, but I didn't like the result, so instead I decided to create a very basic fish using like the sort of figure of 8 thing you would draw in like primary school or elementary school, and it worked better. To create the steam lines above the fish, I used a straight path line and then added a zigzag effect, which allows it to have that wavy edge. The burger used a similar approach, as we were going with basic shapes to make up most of it, and then using the zigzag effect to create that wavy lettuce line. The main goal of this is just to try and create something that looks like the product that you're trying to make, but still can be sort of stylized to work for a very minimal, sort of scaled back icon. The noodle box icon was actually kind of difficult to make, as you had to account for the sort of 3D angle as well as try and make things read accordingly. I wanted the flaps on the box to sort of fold down, as that's quite common for these Asian noodle boxes. For this one, I think the best approach was using the pen tool, the direct selection tool, and controlling the level of roundness on different elements to create that rounded but still boxy shape. Lastly, I wanted to add some chopsticks. The chopsticks would help add to sell the idea of a noodle box. I created the chopsticks and then used the direct selection tool and a little bit of planning to create the sort of depth between the chopsticks, the front of the noodle box and the back of the noodle box. The idea was to add additional points to delete parts of the paths behind the chopsticks while maintaining the chopsticks being inside the pot. This did require a little bit of trial and error, but it worked out quite successfully. I created the icons in a separate document just for ease of working, so all I have to do is just bring them in. But if you're working in the same document, it's perfectly fine. The next step is to actually play with the different elements and like create order which works well for your logo. So for this, I found it was best to have the first line of text, the main text, the icons, and then the bottom line of text, all in like a sort of upside down Christmas tree shape. Where I slightly scaled down the icons, I had to adjust a few bits, including the stroke level to match the text, as well as having to like black out some elements so they read better. Now that I'm happy with the general look and feel of this logo, I'm going to expand everything and create a offset paths to it. This will allow us to create a sort of border element which will contain the entire logo. Where this is quite destructive, I personally prefer to create this on a separate layer by duplicating the entire layer and pasting it into a different layer, and then using this as like my sort of go-to workspace, and then using the main layer as a sort of final compositing space. Select everything on the layer, go to object and expand. You may have to do this a couple times as some things might not always expand properly. Combine all the shapes and then go to object, path and offset paths. This will allow us to create a sort of thick edge around the entire contents that we've selected, but we will have to still refine it. The value of how much you offset it by is entirely up to you, so it's just best to click the preview mode and sort of eyeball it to be something that has enough edge around the artwork, but still not too excessive that it starts moving away from the actual letters themselves. As you will see, there's a lot of white space being created, so these are like sort of counters between positive and negative elements. So all we've got to do is just delete those as they're not needed, and again sort of close up any tight gaps that might pose a threat when we start adding a thicker stroke. If you come across any weird shapes that are a bit awkward to fill, you can use basic geometry tools to just incorporate shapes and just add them together using the Pathfinder. Once you've refined the shape, you next need to copy it back into the original composition and add a stroke to it. This could be something around 10 point. It needs to be just large enough to sort of match the similar characteristics as the rest of the logo. Where the stroke has been added, there might be some points which create sharp corners. For this, I think it kind of kills the aesthetic I'm going for. So I isolated the path and used a rectangle to remove these stray points. I then used the direct selection tool to delete these additional points, as they were not necessary. I then continued to do this to the rest of the logo just to clean up any points that I thought were a bit redundant. Using the direct selection tool, I was able to delete points that were not necessary, as well as isolate points that I needed to tweak and manually adjust. I found adding extra guides to be quite useful when trying to get things to align horizontally. Once you're happy with the look and feel of this outer border, we next need to draw a path which will act as a background element. Essentially, this will look like neon tubes behind the actual logo itself. I found it easy to draw these paths on a separate layer and then set them to a slightly thinner stroke with a round cap. The line length needs to be between the first and last letter. Once you've set up the line, you just need to duplicate it vertically. For this, I just moved it slightly and then used Ctrl D to duplicate it multiple times. I wanted these lines to reach the second subheading. The next thing we have to do is start deleting elements of these lines. So firstly, we can sort of move the top line slightly in using the direct selection tool. And then for the rest of them, we can paint out the additional areas that we don't need using the eraser tool. The eraser tool can be accessed by pressing Shift E. I found it easier to start with the icons as they were pretty big, so you could sort of block out a lot more of the lines. And then for the letters, it was sort of just tracing the actual letter forms themselves. If you do over trim the lines, you can always use the direct selection tool to sort of align the points back together. This will help create more horizontal and vertical aligning elements. With the eraser tool, you can draw or you can just click. I found clicking worked better on more delicate areas, whereas on larger areas, it's easier to just paint out the extra bits. Once you're happy, you can group the layers together and align them centrally and horizontally. This is basically the logo at its most basic point. You can add color and effects within Illustrator, but for this, I want to jump into Photoshop to make it more reminiscent of the images we saw at the beginning of this video. So now copy the entire logo and jump into Photoshop and paste it in as a smart object. Where we created this as a vector file, by pasting in as a smart object will allow us to retain the smooth lines, even though we're working within a bitmap program. Once again, I like to add in central guidelines to help me work out with placements. I'm going to next bring in a texture of a wall. So for this, I found it on Pexels by the username SeanEJ. You don't have to use the same texture, but this is the one I'm going to use. So once you pasted it in, you need to drag it behind the vector smart object as this acts as our background. So turning off the vector smart object will allow us to work directly just on the background for the time being. I first want to remove the color from the image by using the hue and saturation slider, Ctrl U, and just bringing the saturation to 0. Next, I want to increase the contrast between black and white values by using curves. I want to create a sort of swooping curve, which will allow slightly more grit to show within the image. Next, on a new layer, I want to create a radial gradient going from 100% black to completely transparent. This will help create like a vignette effect on the background canvas. It took me a couple of attempts to get this right. I've added an additional layer, which is a solid black fill at an opacity of 5%, just to take the edge off the bright whites on the background. Now, working with the logo itself, we're going to add a few layer styles to it. My approach for this layer was to use a more traditional neon look. So I wanted the edges to be darker and more saturated, whereas the internal elements to be slightly lighter and almost white. And then I needed it to also have like an outer glow. So instead of actually showing you the entire process of how I came to these numbers, what I've done is I've put the 3 different steps on the screen so you can just pause and follow along. The colors don't have to align. It's more so just a case of trying to get the same visual aesthetic. Also, the numbers will change depending on the size of your canvas and the resolution of your canvas. Next, we're going to add in another layer, which will contain our sort of outermost glow. This is more of like a feathered approach. So we're going to just insert a dark purple and sort of paint in loosely where the logo itself covers. Change this blending mode to linear add, as it will create quite a harsh glow, and then just reduce the opacity. You may also have to adjust the glows inside the layer style, just as some of the values might be pushed back a little bit. If you want to adjust the colors on the canvas, what you can do is insert a new layer, fill it with the desired color, and then change the blend type to hue. This will allow you to change the entire canvas color scheme. If you want to color different elements, I would suggest using a round brush with a soft edge to create that sort of gradual change in color. Hopefully you found this tutorial useful. If you did, please drop a like and a comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you.